and welcome, fellow bookworms and film fans. Welcome to this week's episode of The Consented Narrative, where we'll be looking at Salem's Lot. Now, it was written by Stephen King and it was published in 1975. It was then adapted several times to the screen, but I will be looking at the 1979 version. Now, it is in fact actually a two-part miniseries. However, when I mention film, it's just because it's a little bit easier for me to say rather than miniseries each and every time. So do bear that in mind while I'm reading out the synopsis. Every time I say film, I do mean miniseries. Now, I will be looking at obviously three things. I'll be looking at how good is the film, how good is the book, and how good does the plot take from the book to the big screen. Now, please bear in mind that there are spoilers in this episode. There are spoilers in every single episode, as I do discuss the film and the book in its entirety. So we'll start off with the film, well, the miniseries. Now, the miniseries was a two-parter, and it really did get the sinister elements of the whole Stephen King universe and the Stephen King feeling to it. The sort of like the unrealistic, you know, this is a nice town, this is a happy town, and yet underneath there's like all these little like, you know, a mum hits a child and a wife cheats on a husband, and you know, somebody cheats out somebody of like, it's just all these little things, and he likes to play on sort of like the human intricacies as well as sort of like the supernatural intricacies as well, and it really brought that very well, and I loved that feeling in the miniseries. Like the score was really good, because obviously you listen out to the music in kind of like horror films and stuff, and so when you hear the score go off and you're like, oh, something bad about to happen, and 9 times out of 10 it actually does. So it really did bring all those sort of like elements together. Now also as well is what it did very, very well is it showed how quickly sort of like a virus, which obviously we find out is vampirism, but it does show how quickly a virus can spread. Now, obviously I do bear in mind that at the moment we are obviously dealing with COVID. That's not why I did this book. It is just sort of like a scary view. And obviously when he wrote it, he wasn't thinking about this as well. But also when you look in the modern day as well, how quickly things spread, because of the fact that, you know, it's just sort of like one person can then affect 2 people, 2 people affect 4 people, and so on and so forth. And that was sort of terrifying in looking at that as well. Also, the design of Mr. Barlow. Now, I know he is drastically different in the book, but this is just how I view the film, and this is how much I enjoy it. And that iconic look, the sort of like the fangs, the bald head, the like, it was brilliantly done. And you only actually see him 3 times in the miniseries. Which I think is really well done, because otherwise you kind of oversaturate the character, and you know, you kind of get this feeling, oh, it's him again. Whereas, you know, in the miniseries you get him 3 times and that's it, and it means that every time you see him it's kind of special, and you're like, oh, and you're kind of a little bit scared of him. I definitely would have been if I watched it as a child. My husband apparently watched it as a child and was not scared, but apparently nothing scares him, so there we go. Now, honestly, I do appreciate that it relies sort of like on the scare factor, and there's a scene where sort of like this little boy that had died, and he comes up to the window, and apparently that scared a lot of people when it came out originally, this little kid knocking on the window trying to like get his older brother to open it up so he can feast on him. Obviously I watched it as an adult and wasn't as freaked out, but my weakness in horror films, and it really is a weakness in horror films, is kids in horror films. Like, I just they just scare me to a point that maybe they shouldn't, but they just really do. So I was still a little bit unsettled by these characters. And although at some parts it does seem a bit dated, as the series does get older, I do think it kind of brings itself through the centuries quite well, and I feel like it is something that you can still watch and enjoy in this 21st century. And a couple of times you'll sort of sit there and be like, yeah, should you have said that? But like, it's not a horrible thing. It's not like racist or overly like, you know, misogynist. It's just every now and then there'll be like a phrase or something you'll be like, But other than that, I mean, it's a fantastic little mini series. As I said, it is a 2-parter. It's like an hour and a half each part, so it's like a 3 hours that you got to put one aside. But I think, you know, for an October viewing, it's absolutely fantastic, and it gets a 7 out of 10 for me. I would definitely recommend this little mini series. Now the book. Now this is one of my most favourite Stephen King books, and as you can see sort of like on the shelf there, we've got quite a few. It is a double extra deep shelf, so there's Stephen King books behind that and Stephen King books on the shelf behind there. And it is one of my favourite Stephen King books. It's so brilliantly written. It kind of has a slow build to it. You kind of like, even though you're not, like, obviously after you've read it, you're like, well, vampires, and you kind of have an idea that's what it is. That, like, Stephen King himself doesn't actually bring in the whole vampire thing until quite late in the book. It's just sort of suggestions and hints rather than anything. And I love that in it, because you sort of sat there going, it has to be. Like, what else could it be? And it's like, by the end of it, you're going, well, I knew it, but but he didn't want to mention it for such a long time. And I thoroughly enjoyed that part of it. You know, again, it's how quickly the virus spread. So it's sort of like, after the two Glick boys disappear, you see one of them do come back in the miniseries, whereas in the book it's kind of discussed that this kid is never coming back as a vampire or otherwise. So you've got kind of that feeling when the Glick boys disappear. Then you've got Danny Glick coming back, trying to get his mom and get someone else, and Mike Grierson, and it's just all these different characters, and you sort of like, you know, as I said before, one person infects two people infect four people, and so on and so forth. And there's a brilliantly sort of like sequence of chapters towards the end where it goes through who's infected who, basically, and who's left. And the people that are left are people without relatives and without loved ones, and they're kind of like single people. And it's just brilliantly written in that respect, because you sat there going, I mean, it's got you thinking, like, if a virus does hit, sort of like if like a vampiric virus does hit, you know, who would come knocking on my door, or who would I go and knock on the door to? Like, who would get infected by who? And it was brilliantly done. I love rereading the story every time, and it's not, I mean, it is a decent whack of a book there, but it's not one of his biggest books. You know, and it is something that you can kind of put down and pick up, but it is a fantastic read. And honestly, I mean, there are some Stephen King books that I will probably never read again. Tommyknockers being one of them. I swear to God, that took me 6 months to read, and I hate that book with a vengeance. I probably wouldn't read the Dark Tower series again, but this book, I would 100% just pick up again. You can get it done in a couple of weeks, and it's just such a good read. And at the end, you kind of sat there and you're feeling for the main character so much, and you're kind of going, oh, like, what would you do in that situation? And I love that as well, because you go in, you know what it is, they know what it is, but what would you do if you were confronted with that? Would you go out and kill the people that you know and love because they're vampires? Who knows? Stephen King knows, but who knows? So honestly, I would definitely recommend this book. It gets a 9 out of 10 for me. 100% would recommend this book. Now the plot. Now I will be going on about the plot for a bit, because as much as I love the miniseries and as much as I love the book, it is quite different. So the film starts with Mark and Ben 2 years in the future getting holy water, and then, you know, they're going, oh, they found us. And then it cuts back to the Marston house, and Salem's lot. Now, interesting little fact is, I don't know why, I just assumed the first time I read it that Salem's lot and Jerusalem's lot were two different places. It's not. Salem's lot is an abbreviation of Jerusalem's lot, which is why it's got the little like apostrophe in the beginning. And I felt so stupid when Michael told me, and I was literally just like, I knew that. But yeah, so just a little fun fact there. So anyway, so then in the film it kind of goes back to Salem's lot and the Marston's house. The book, however, starts with two strangers. For the moment, we kind of figure out that it is Ben and Mark later on the run, as it were, from Salem's lot. But they're still getting news and everything to try and find out what's going on, you know, if they need to go back, basically, because they're the only ones that really understand what's going on. And we find out about the whole population pretty much just disappearing. Some of them moved out, some of them kind of realised and left, but pretty much the whole population is gone. So then the boy and the man, they make a decision at one point that they have to go back. But then we end up back in Salem's lot, meeting Ben properly for the first time. So you then learn of his obsession with the Marston house, and in the film we come across Mr. They say, in the miniseries they call him Stryker, but his surname is spelt Straker. So for the purposes of this episode, I'm going to call him Straker, because that is how it is spelled. And I was always taught, say it how it's spelled. So if I am wrong in the if I am mispronouncing it, just tough. So anyway, so you find out about Mr. Straker for the first time, and you see him for the first time when you kind of go back. Now, the Marston house is basically Salem's Lot haunted house. Now, Stephen King deals with this a lot, where a lot of these things have like a haunted house to it. You know, you see it in Ear, you see it in Black House, you see it in a lot of these books, that they've got that one house in the village that no one goes to, that it's cursed and everything like that. So the Marston house is basically Salem's Lot answer to this. So in the film, Ben asks after renting the Marston house, and he's like, "Oh, can I rent it?" But he's been told that it's been sold. So he gets given directions to a boarding house, and he ends up staying there. Now, he also kind of ends up staying at the boarding house in the book as well, and you hear about him trying to rent out the house, but you don't really see that interaction as much. So that's kind of like a little bit there. But in both, Ben comes across Susan, who is reading his book that he's wrote, because Ben's a prolific, well, I said prolific, that's not right. He is an author. They end up chatting and kind of hitting it off. So in the film, Ben ends up having dinner with Susan and her parents pretty much early on, and then heading to the lake. Now in the film, Susan's parents really quite like him and hit it off with him, and Susan's dad is the town doctor, which we will find out later is not his occupation in the book. So in the book, he tells Susan about going up to the Marston house, seeing Hubert Marston's body, hanging from a board like a ghost, because obviously he hung himself, and then, you know, running out, and as a kid kind of, you know, dealing with that, and then coming back as an adult to kind of exorcise the demon, as it were. Now, he tells the story to Susan in the book, but to Mr. Burke in the film. So it's sort of like slightly different there as well. Now in the book as well, you do get quite a lot look into other people's lives, sort of like, you know, the day-to-day, as it were, and the breakdown of what they're all doing at certain times of the day. And also in the book, Mark is seen as the new kid in the film, you know, to Salem's Lot, but in the book he's grown up there, which is a weird thing. I don't understand why Mark, you know, was new in the book but pretty much grew up in the film, but either way. So then in the film, Larry Crockett, who's a realtor who sold the Marston house, is having an affair with his assistant, Mrs. Sawyer, to which the husband, Mr. Sawyer, gets an inkling that that's what's happening. However, in the book, there is no affair with Crockett and Sawyer. In fact, Mrs. Sawyer is still sleeping around, but she's sleeping with Corey Bryant. And that, you know, she's still a hussy, you know, she's still sleeping around, it's fine. Now in both, Sue was with a guy called, now it's Floyd Tebbets in the book, but Ned Tebbets in the film. This will happen a couple of times. I don't know why. So Floyd/Ned, Susan is going round with, but then decides that she's not happy with him, she doesn't like him, she likes Ben, so she kind of calls it quits with him and carries on with Ben, which comes back to bite Ben on the backside, as it were. So then we get Ben finally meeting Susan's parents in the book. Now, in the film, as I said, her dad is the town doctor. In the book, he's a union rep for the dock workers. And in both, Mr. Norton really does like Ben. However, in the book, Mrs. Norton really dislikes Ben, like really hates him. And it becomes more apparent as the book goes on. Now, we do see Straker a lot more in the film than we do in the book. He seems to be, you know, around a lot more, talking to a lot more people. In fact, you know, Ben and Mr. Straker kind of eyeball each other quite a few times as well before they get the eventual confrontation. Now, we do get, in both, a dog is murdered in a graveyard, poor little doggy. And we learn it's because basically Straker was killing the dog to make way for his master, Mr. Barlow, coming along. As you do. So then in both as well, you get the Glick boys that disappear. Now, it's on the way to Mark's house because he's a newbie and he doesn't really know anybody, and the Glick boys are going over to see his train set, when in actuality it's his horror collection. So they disappear on the way to Mark's house, but in the film they disappear on the way back from Mark's house. Now, Ralphie is never seen again ever again. In the film, we do see him kind of like knocking on the window and draining Danny's blood, but we don't really see that in the book. Like, he just disappears and we never hear of him again. But Danny re-emerges from the woods and eventually ends up in hospital because obviously he has a low blood count because he's being drained by his little brother. Well, as I said, little brother in the film, we're not entirely sure who's draining him in the book. I think it's, just Mr. Barlow, really. So in the film, on that same night that the Glick boys disappear, Ned/Floyd and Mike bring a crate from the docks to the Marston house. However, this happens the night after in the book, and it's two guys we don't really know. They're mentioned a couple of times in the books and we don't really see them again. Now, in both instances, however, the guys are terrified when they deliver the crate to the house. They kind of get this eerie feeling of how cold it is and everything like that. And they end up escaping extremely quickly. However, one of them believes in the book that he saw the clothes of the missing Glick boy, but it is also told by Mr. Crockett that no, that's not what you saw, and here's some money to forget that that's what you saw. And also in the same night as well, in the film, that Mr. Sawyer, this is when Mr. Sawyer tricks his wife into thinking it's safe to call Crockett round for a late night rendezvous, as it were. Mr. Sawyer catches them in the act, threatens to kill Crockett, doesn't kill Crockett. Crockett escapes, gets caught by Mr. Barlow and killed. And then Mr. Sawyer goes in and basically beats on Mrs. Sawyer, and then they get out of town pretty much the next day. So then Crockett is found dead by Ben and Susan, who were just chilling in each other's company by the lake. And he is dead as a dodo. However, Mr. Crockett survives to the very end in the book. So rest in peace, poor Mr. Crockett in the film, but in the book, well done, you survived. So in both, they then, they are searching for Ralphie as well. As I said, like all of that I just mentioned happened in one night pretty much. So they're searching for Ralphie as well, and they can't find him to no avail. But then in the film and the book, it's kind of cast suspicion upon Straker, Barlow and Ben, because obviously they're the three newbies, and that's when the Glick boy disappeared. So then Gillespie, who's the cop, basically then gets a check run against Ben, Mr. Straker and Mr. Barlow, as they're kind of suspects. He talks to Ben and Mr. Straker, but doesn't actually kind of call them in or official question. And in fact, Gillespie believes that Ben's pretty much innocent. He's still not quite sure on Straker though. So then in the film, we have Ralphie come to the window as a vampire and drain some of Danny's blood before he ends up in hospital. However, in both, when Danny ends up in hospital, he then passes away. So then the book leaves it ambiguous at this point in the film. Sorry, the book leaves it ambiguous as to how he died or who killed him. But in the film, we are well aware. So this is another thing, is in the film, we are well aware straight away that it's vampires. It's 100% that. In the book, as I said, it's still not been mentioned that it is vampires. So in the film, Ben has now made friends with the old teacher, Mr. Burke. Now, in the film, he's called Jason. In the book, he's called Matt. Again, why? It doesn't matter. It's fine. Whatever. So anyway, so in the film, he's made friends with Mr. Burke. In the book, he's yet to meet him. And in fact, in the book, Ben seems to be spending a lot more time with Susan and Susan's family than he ever really does in the film. So anyway, Ben finds out about Danny's death. Now, in the film, he wants to attend the funeral, and when the funeral happens, Susan is actually off in Boston for a job interview. But Ben has come to the funeral to kind of have a look because he's starting to get suspicions that something isn't quite right. But in the book, Ben goes for a walk with Susan, ends up taking her flower, as it were, then going to a local bar, and then finally meeting Mr. Burke. Now, as we know in the film, he's already met Mr. Burke at the school he used to go to way before the Glick Boys incident. However, in both, Mr. Burke and Ben kind of hit off an unlikely friendship, and they become firm friends quite quickly. So there is a longer passage of time in the book than there is in the film. But then we get to Danny Glick's funeral. So Mike is left to fill in the grave, but he ends up opening the casket. And in the book, it's not said that Danny attacks Mike, but in the film, it's quite obvious. So again, another instance where we're like, vampires, 100%. In the book, we're like, something ain't right. Something's not going right here. But Mark as well overhears his parents talking about him because they think he should be showing more emotion, but he doesn't, because, you know, in the book he doesn't really know the Glick boys, but in the film he is still friends with them, but he doesn't show that much emotion because he kind of keeps it tampered down. So anyway, Gillespie then gets the info about Ben, Barlow and Straker. None of it brings back anything relevant. None of them kind of show any like history or anything like that. And it shows nothing of interest. But in the book, Mr. Barlow, now this is one of the biggest differences, is he's a suave gentleman. He's like a European gentleman. He holds conversations with people, and he takes out the person that's running the dump first of all to feed on him. However, in the film, you know, we see a hand take Larry Crockett and we assume that's Mr. Barlow taking him. But the first time we actually see Mr. Barlow is when he's taking Ned/Floyd in the cell. And it's more of a creature who doesn't talk rather than sort of like a suave gentleman. Another thing as well, pardon the cough, Father Callahan is more prominent in the book, and he is an alcoholic as well. And it's clear that he's lost his faith, but also he hasn't lost his faith. So he's kind of just deciding if it's evil with a big E or evil with a small e. But in the film, we only really see him twice, at Danny's funeral and then at a scene later with Mark and his parents. In the book as well, we hear about Straker opening the store as a bit of an afterthought, rather than in the film we see the big opening. We see him charm everyone and talk to everyone and, you know, make everyone love him. So then in the book as well, Mr. Burke sees Mike, who's looking unwell, and he sees us in a pub that he's kind of gone to. He's gone to a bar, he's getting a drink. He sees Mike looking unwell, Mike Grayson, who buried Danny, and he kind of invites him back to his house and is like, you know, get a good night's sleep. In the film, this kind of still happens, but it's Ben and Mr. Burke who see Mike come in, sit down at the table and look like he's death warmed up. So then Mike ends up at Mr. Burke's house in both. And that evening, you know, Mike invites someone in, and this is kind of when we're getting our first inklings in the book that's, you know, it might be vampires, because Mr. Burke doesn't want to go into the room. He hears a child's laughter. He then calls up Ben at like 4 a.m. Ben comes out and Mike is dead. But he doesn't look dead. He looks just, you know, like he's sleeping almost. So then this is when Mr. Burke goes, I think it'd be vampires. And I think this is kind of the first time that we get this insinuation that it actually is vampires in the book. So this all happens. Ben gets called over. They kind of call Gillespie. Gillespie's like, well, you know, is there anything that I should be aware of? And they're like, no, it's fine. Ben then decides to go back to the boarding house as he's trying to sleep. Now he gets jumped in the room, but in the film he gets jumped out in his car by Ned/Floyd. So he jumps Ben, beats 10 times of living hell out of him. Ben ends up in hospital. Ned/Floyd ends up in a cell. And that is exactly pretty much the same. So obviously Susan then finds out that Ben's in hospital, goes to visit, checks that everyone's okay. But this is where we really see in the book like the venomance that Susan's mum has towards Ben. Like, she hates him and basically tries to like take pleasure in being like, yeah, he's gone, like he's been beat up by Ned/Floyd, you're like, you know, you need to go with him. And so Susan's like, no, I'm moving out, I'm done with you, it's gone. So anyway, so while Ben is in hospital in the film, Mr. Burke, as I said, is at home, and he has Mike come in the window and try to drink his blood. Mr. Burke battles, you know, it's like I rescind the invitation. Mike falls out the window, and Mr. Burke suffers from a heart attack and gets called into hospital. Now this is pretty much the same in the book, except Susan has gone to check on Mr. Burke and is there when this happens. So this is when Mr. Burke starts filling Susan in on the whole vampire nonsense. But Mr. Burke still ends up in hospital with a heart attack, except Susan is there with him. So then as well in both, we get Mrs. Glick collapse and then later pass away. And we've got Mr. Burke is now in hospital in intensive care. Now, at this point as well, in the book, Mr. Burke still continues to be a big presence until later on, whereas in the film, this is kind of the last we see of him. He's in intensive care, that's it. He's, you know, we never see him die, we never see him live, so it's just sort of like he's gone out of our minds, really. So now, in the book, we get the scene of Mr. Sawyer walking in on his wife cheating. Again, as I said, it's Corey Bryant, not Larry Crockett, but the scene goes down exactly the same way. Threatens to kill Corey Bryant, chases him out, beats up his wife. Corey Bryant gets taken off by Mr. Barlow and turned into a vampire. So this is pretty much exactly the same, except just a lot earlier in the film, and it's just a different bloke that Mr. Sawyer catches his wife having an affair with. So we get Danny as well coming to the window of Mark's bedroom. Now, Mark is not a silly boy. Like, he loves monsters and horrors and everything. So he realizes pretty quickly that Danny isn't Danny. And he manages to ward him off with a cross and kind of realizes at that point that something is going on in this town that maybe shouldn't. It does happen a little bit earlier in the film as well, that scene. Now, in the book as well now, as I said, Mr. Burke appears to get better. He's still in hospital, but he's now still a part of the team, and we don't see that in the film. But in the book, Sue and Ben clue Dr. Cody in, who start then seeing similarities in the but in the film, Ben gets Dr. Norton up to speed, who then helps Sue to understand, so it's kind of the opposite way round. And although she doesn't quite believe it in both, she still kind of listens to them. So in the book as well, she goes marching up to the Marston house to confront whatever or whoever is residing within. This happens a little later in the film, but in both she ends up unwittingly paired up with Mark, who is then going off to take out Mr. Barlow as well. And both Ben and the doctor then go out and sit with Mrs. Glick's dead body to see if the whole vampire theory is true. It is. They take on Mrs. Glick's body. She disappears, but the only difference is Dr. Cody gets bit in the book, but not in the film. So Susan and Mark get caught. Mark, and this is again the same in the film as it is in the book. Mark gets tied up and Susan gets taken to meet Mr. Barlow. So this is when we see, Mark then manages to escape. The only difference here is that he attacks and pretty much kills Straker, whereas Straker gets attacked and shot by Ben a little later in the film. Mark escapes, but he can't get Susan in time, so Susan then becomes a vampire. And again, in the film it's slightly different because we don't actually see Susan become a vampire. We see her right at the very end of the film, whereas in the book it's kind of like pretty much the same night Susan comes to Mark's window, is like, "Let me in, Mark," and Mark's like, "Hell no." So anyway, in the book as well, we've got Father Callahan coming and taking a running jump in. And he's with Mr. Burke in the hospital. They have an in-depth discussion about the vampires in Salem's Lot, which is how Callahan gets involved. In the film, he just happens to be in a house when Barlow enters. So anyway, in the book, we get Mark going to find Ben and a description of how quickly the infection is spreading through the town as well. And in the film, we get Mr. Barlow going into Mark's house, killing his parents and infecting Father Callahan. And in fact, this is why in the film, Mark ends up at the Marston house and Susan ends up being turned into a vampire. In the book, Mark just ends up at the Marston house before, and the reason he goes to the Marston house, and then because of that, Mr. Barlow then goes and kills his parents. So anyway, in the book, the doctor, Ben, Mark and Mr. Burke make a plan of attacking the hospital. In the film, it's just Ben and the doctor at this point. So first of all, they go to Father Callahan, confess their sins, get, holy water and everything like that to take it on. And then they end up heading to the house to take care of Mr. Barlow. And they come across a letter he's written to them saying that he basically understood everything they were going to do and he's left. But he's left Susan there to basically be taken out by Ben. So Ben at this point has now killed Susan. Again, in the film, she's still alive, undead, right until the end. So then after finding, let's have a look. So then they're sort of like going around the town and trying to find out where Mr. Barlow is now hiding. They then sort of, let's try and phrase this one differently. So after finding out that Mark in the book took out Straker, in the film, the Doctor dies while taking on Straker and Ben shoots him. So that's a slight difference as well. Now in the book, we get the scene of Mr. Barlow going into Mark's house, killing his parents and converting Father Callahan by testing his faith against his. And this happened a lot earlier in the film. So in the film as well, they only stake Mr. Barlow, and it's Mark and Ben. In the book, they make it their mission to try and take out as many as they can along the way to killing Mr. Barlow, which they don't do. They only end up killing Mr. Barlow. So in the book, we get the added of seeing Byron, the kid of having an affair with Mrs. Sawyer, come back as a vampire and kill Mr. and Mrs. Sawyer as well. And we also see in the book Callahan run away from Salem's Lot. Now, in the book, Mr. Burke passes away and the Doctor gets killed by Barlow inadvertently because the Doctor drops onto a pile of knives that have been left at the bottom of the sawn-off stairs. So this then now leaves Ben and Mark. And obviously in the film, once Susan had kind of disappeared, it was just Ben and Mark anyway. So Barlow has moved from the Marston house to the boarding house. And so, you know, in both, despite the venue, Ben and Mark find a little cupboard that is locked, pull out Mr. Barlow's coffin from the hidey hole and stake him to death. And in both, Gillespie as well decides that the town is dying and decides to basically run off and he's had enough. So in the film, they drive out and leave Salem's Lot behind. And they do that in the book as well. The book ends with Ben and Mark going back to Salem's Lot, setting a fire and then making a plan to deal with the vampires. The film ends with Ben staking Susan and him and Mark heading off into the sunset. So in case you couldn't tell, this plot is hugely different. While it did keep the same ambience and a few of the plot points remain the same, they changed a lot of the continuity of the film and the book. They kind of had a look at the plot points and went, right, this one will do better here and this one will do better here. So that kind of annoyed me a little bit, but it was still a good, you know, film and miniseries and book. You know, they took away the bigger role that Susan played and that Mr. Burke played. You know, they changed characters' names and their characteristics for no apparent reason whatsoever, and they changed their job descriptions as well. So, you know, they also changed Mr. Barlow as well, like they completely changed him. So as good as both narratives are, the plot is a very different take on a classic story, and therefore it gets a 3 out of 10 for me. Now, as I said, this is my opinion. If at any point, you know, you agree or disagree, please leave it below in the comments. Don't forget to click subscribe as well to be alerted for the next video. And just remember to generally keep it contento.